Hi everyone, Dr. Scott Stevens here with a video on an easy way to make ogives using pivot tables. Hopefully you know what an ogive is. We had a video on it earlier. It is a cumulative relative frequency distribution. You see one here on the screen right now which talks about the total pay of people in San Francisco. This is a sample of about 22,000 people. How do we read such a chart? Well, you pick a number on the horizontal axis. This axis actually represents the person's total pay, and then you go up from that number until you reach a particular point on the curve. Here, for example, I'm looking at 100,000 people, and if I go sideways over to the axis itself, I'm hitting it somewhere about 56%. Conclusion? About 56% of the people in this study made less than or equal to $100,000. That's what makes it a less than or equal to ogive. So we can see by the time we get to $200,000 that we've gotten almost everybody. $200,000 corresponds to maybe 97% of the total size of this sample. Some people have higher salaries, some have lower, but as the line goes from left to right, it also goes higher because more and more people are less than or equal to each cutoff. A lot of times these graphs are created after somebody's already created a histogram, and then it's done by building running totals off of those categories. But there's an easier way to do it that uses pivot tables, and that's what this video is about today. I'm going to show you exactly how to do that. I'm not going to use this San Francisco data, which is quite large. Instead, I'm going to use example 2.4 out of Donnelly's book. It's the data set that you see over here on the right. And we'll go step by step in order to create an ogive, less than or equal to ogive, for that. First thing to do, I want to make a pivot table, and every column of a pivot table has to have a heading. So I'm going to left click on this first row, right click, and say insert, so I can give this variable a name. Donnelly never talks about what the variable is actually about, so I'll just give it a name, data. You could call it whatever you wanted. Alright, now that I have it, I'm going to highlight that name and all the data in the column, and then choose insert, and the very first item on the menu is pivot table. You'll see this requester pop up, and the information about where the data is will already be entered into here because you highlighted it to begin with. I'll just say OK, and that opens up another sheet on this same workbook. My data is still back there, but here's the new sheet we're working on. As long as this box over here is selected, you'll have all this information over here. If it disappears, no problem, just click inside that box and it will appear again. What are we going to do? We're going to grab the name of our variable, here it's data, and drag it down into the rows box. Then I'm going to go back up to the top again and grab it and drag it down into the values box. The words that you will now see, because we started with a numeric variable, says sum of that data. We don't want it to say sum, and here's how we change it. Left click on the little arrow and choose the only thing you choose from this menu really, which is the value field settings, and on this menu we're going to change two different things. First, instead of sum, we want count. So go ahead and hit that. And then we'll go to the Show Values As tab and pull down and go way to the bottom of that and choose percent running total in. Note to users of Excel on the Mac, last time that I looked, the Mac did not have the capability of doing this particular setting. So this won't be helping you. If you want to use this technique, you'd need to be on a PC, or Mac will have to get its act together a little bit more in terms of how we can show values. Anyway, once you do this, you'll see the values over here indicate what percentage fall into each point on the data. Now, the graph I want to make to turn this into an ogive is a scatter plot, but unfortunately there are some kinds of pivot charts that Excel can't handle. If I'm inside the chart and say insert a pivot chart and say that I want a scatter plot, it's going to say I can't create this type of chart in pivot table. Well, too bad, but we can get around that. Take all the data in the table, highlight it, Control C will copy, and come over here and Control V will paste. I have a perfect copy of my data. It's just a bunch of numbers here, as you can see. But now I am allowed to make a scatter plot with this, which is what I'll do. I'll highlight all the data and say insert a scatter plot, and I want straight lines between my data points. What I've got here is essentially a less than or equal to ogive. Less than or equal to, I did type that with an underline, ogive. I don't know what the data really is, so I'll just put it's Donnelly 2.4. Okay, and I can clean it up a little bit. The horizontal axis is starting at 0, but my smallest observation is about 13. So I'm going to left click on the axis, right click, say Format Axis, and then say that I want the smallest value to be 13, let's say, and the biggest value is 45. That's okay, I can leave that alone. On my vertical axis, it's going up to 120%, and who wants that? So I'll do the same thing, format axis, and make the top 100%, which is the number 1, and I've expressed it as a percentage. I can make that a little nicer again, because I can say format axis and make the number of decimal places equal to 0. Why do I want any decimals for my axis? I don't. So I've got a picture like this. It was that fast to create the ogive, and it's a more detailed ogive than you would get if you first gathered the data into groups and then did the ogive. Well, there's one more thing that I ought to do. Ogives are supposed to start at 0% and go up to 100%. The technique I just showed you will end at 100%, but it will start a little bit after 0. So let's go ahead and fix that. I'm going to go up to my data set and put one more entry before the beginning of the data, for example at 13, and I'll assign that with 0%. Now I'm going to go over to my graph and say to include that in my data. I'll right click, say select data, edit my series, and say I don't want those to be my x values, I want all of those to be my x values. And I don't want these to be my y values, I want all of these to be my y values. I can then say OK. And now I've got a graph that does what it's supposed to, all the way from 0 up to 100%. And if I didn't like the fact that the 48 was beyond all of my data, I could easily adjust that axis too. But I'll leave that alone for now. That's all there is to it. I hope that you enjoyed this and you find it useful.